Hi, I'm Randy Bach. I'm here today, July 7th, 2023, with Stefan Mychajliw. Stefan, tell us a little about yourself and your role in the Vivek Ramaswamy campaign.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Officially, I am the Deputy Communications Director for Vivek Ramaswamy 2024. Proud to be a part of his campaign. I'm a blue collar kid, grew up the son of Ukrainian immigrants in Buffalo, New York. I half jokingly say my family learned the English language from the numbers 1 through 75 and BINGO at our Catholic bingo hall. Syracuse University for journalism. I was an investigative journalist for about 20 years on television, and then ran for public office myself as the Erie County Comptroller. Similar to a taxpayer watchdog position. Then after that, didn't run for office again. I believed in term limits and had self-imposed term limits. And then started working on presidential campaigns through a company called Big Dog Strategies. I helped Vivek Ramaswamy for his launch of his presidential campaign in New Hampshire and joined the team as his deputy communications director. So it's proud to be a part of his campaign. It's we call it a movement rather than a campaign itself, but I'm proud of
that. I had the good fortune of meeting Vivek at the Porcupine Festival up in New Hampshire about 2 weeks ago. It's called Pork Fest, libertarian event, and he spoke at the big tent, and then he spoke at Brownstone, for which I'm a writer. I had a chance to meet him personally and privately. He is an interesting man. I have seen more of him online and in the news media, and I think he is forthright. I've done kind of a little bit of a dive on him recently in preparation for today, and it seems as if he has, he's the real deal. He goes back and he's consistent in what he says. I was looking at an article from the Harvard Crimson 2005, and I think he was only a sophomore at the time, or maybe a junior. I'll see if I can show it here. But I just put this up perhaps as an emblem for our viewers that he is kind of the real deal intellectually. He's consistent. He hasn't changed his opinions, and this is really a very forthright defense of an unpopular proposition, the uncounted cost of a living wage. And I don't want to go too far into that, but I just put that up and people can reference them later. But he's able to take on the logical defense for what is has a nice phrase. Affirmative action has a nice phrase. Living wage is a nice phrase, and I think the left tends to capitalize on the phraseology and the speechifying, and they define their turf, and you can't go against that because you're a bad person if you do. So just briefly, what was your attraction to Vivek, and what are your sensibilities about where he gets this forthrightness, his courage, and his convictions?
That's a great question. He's the real deal. He's refreshing, actually. Most campaign consultants come in and they show a candidate, here's the polls, here's the issues you're going to care about, here's what you should say, here's the positions you should take. And Vivek Ramaswamy does the exact opposite. He has the courage of his convictions, and every single decision he makes on the campaign trail is what is going to be best for the American people. Mm-hmm. It's refreshing and sometimes frustrating to say, hey, boss, here's this poll or here's this idea, and this is where the wind's blowing, and then this one issue. But he truly does have the courage of his convictions, and again, doesn't listen to polls, focus groups. He listens to his own heart and makes decisions that way. It's great to be a part of his presidential team. And look, you want to talk about his motives. Vivek is 37 years old. He is the first millennial Republican to run for president of the United States. He's not running for the paycheck. He truly believes in service over self and giving back to lead a national revival. He does not need to run for president of the United States, but he sees the direction that our country is going in under the disastrous leadership of President Biden, and he wants to make America a better place to live for his family, his two sons, and for generations of Americans. So every single decision he ever makes, Randy, every single one is, okay, does this align with my values? Is this what I believe? And at the end of the day, everything he talks about is what is going to be best for the American people. I've never met a candidate like him, quite frankly. And I was a former candidate. I help candidates run for office, and it's quite refreshing. And that's why we say around the office. This really isn't a campaign. It's more of a movement. I think people are really attracted to that. People are so sick and tired of politicians. They're sick and tired of career politicians and people who've been in government for a long time, basically trashing this country and driving it off a fiscal and social and economic cliff. And so Vivek wants to turn this country around and hopefully have, a landslide similar to one that Ronald Reagan had in 1980 when he ran against Jimmy Carter.
So we're all familiar with Barack Obama's Hope and Change, which sounded good, but it's very vague. So without being vague and saying he's this and that, what are the basic propositions? What is the movement behind the man?
Well, when it comes down to brass tacks and getting the job done for the American people, Vivek Ramaswamy says the first thing he's going to do is eliminate the executive order that will end affirmative action within the federal government. That is firm. That's a fact. He's going to do it. Lyndon Johnson signed it. It was Executive Order 11246 that established affirmative action as an executive order. So he says with one full swoop, the first thing he's going to do in the White House is get rid of that, eliminate that, because that should not be in place for the federal workforce. And the fact that 20% of federal contracts have to go towards certain groups of individuals and companies. His platform on the southern border when it comes to protecting our country. A nation without a border is not a nation. And Vivek Ramaswamy says he will use the U.S. military to not only secure the border, but then to bomb cartels to stop the free flow of fentanyl, which originates in China, sometimes goes through Mexico, and is poisoning kids in every single corner of our country. Reforming the Fed, cutting that bloated bureaucracy by 90% and making sure that their only mission and job is stabilizing the dollar. That's it. No politics, no putting their finger on the scale of the economy, picking winners or losers. The Fed, reform it. And then when it comes to the deep state and the bureaucracy, basically shutting down a lot of those so-called three-letter agencies. And Vivek is leading the charge on that. The Department of Education, shut it down, day one, and then allocate funding directly to the states so that states decide what is best for students in their respective areas. Shutting down the FBI. We're looking at, the weaponization of law enforcement to take out political opponents, specifically Donald Trump, an opponent of Vivek Ramaswamy for the president. So basically shutting down that and other deep state bureaucracies and building from scratch. And also the one I think that's really resonating too, Randy, is Vivek wants to put in 8-year term limits for bureaucrats within the federal government. The thought process is if there are 8-year term limits for the president of the United States, so too should there be 8-year term limits for bureaucrats within the federal government to bring in fresh blood, new ideas, and he's going to lead by example on all of those factors.
So I don't know if you noticed my grimace. I grimaced at one of those. Do you know which one that was?
I'm guessing it's the border, Randy.
Yeah. We have it wasn't the border specifically. I believe in the integrity of the border, but bombing the cartels. Now, where are we talking about bombing cartels, and with whose agreement would this be? And do we run the risk of, I guess, inviting the opposite when other countries disagree with some of our own policies or exportations?
Well, let's go back to 2015 when then candidate Donald Trump said, we're going to build the wall. Well, the wall wasn't completed, it wasn't built, and that was a campaign on, quite frankly, vengeance and grievance. And Vivek Ramaswamy basically wants to build on that to get the job done. His America First agenda is taking the seeds of what Donald Trump planted and going farther and getting the job done, and not just running a campaign on vengeance and grievance. The wall is not enough. A lot of these cartels can simply build a tunnel and go right under it, even if one is built. So when it comes to bombing cartels, that's a big part of Vivek's foreign policy platform. He's talked to numerous leaders within and out of the government, people with experience at the White House, former attorney generals, to say, is this something that the President of the United States could do to use the military in this capacity? They agreed, Vivek agrees, and that's just a big part of his foreign policy platform. He has to go farther than just building a wall and securing the border. He wants to go a lot farther and basically, his words now, Vivek Ramaswamy's words, decimate cartels, and bombing them is the way to do it.
Does AMLO, this is Luis I can't remember. I read Obrador, the Mexican president. Does he sign off on this?
I don't think it's going to matter whether or not foreign leaders agree with Vivek Ramaswamy's foreign policies. He's very clear, whether it's Mexico or China. Vivek Ramaswamy had said he's going to call the president of Mexico and tell them, get rid of the cartels, stop fentanyl from flowing freely across our border. If you don't take care of it, I will. Those are Vivek Ramaswamy's exact words. The foreign policy when it comes to China, Vivek Ramaswamy had said he's going to declare independence from China, that it puts the United States in a very dangerous position to be reliant on our enemy for the phones in our pocket and the shoes on our feet. And those days are over. So Vivek Ramaswamy is going to declare independence from China, and it may hurt when it comes to the business community and businesses doing business overseas. But it all goes back to his America First agenda, whether it's being tough with China or being tough on the border and securing our border, because at the end of the day, those policies protect the American people.
Fair enough. So just as far as China goes, is this moving beyond tariffs, Donald Trump's weapon of choice, as it were? Are we going to stop, I don't know, I'm not sure the brand names, LG or something like that, TVs from coming in? Are we going to be making those exact items? It seems to be a difficult proposition. But I'm in accord with certain aspects of it. If we do have a military confrontation and we don't make anything here, it is an issue. But tell us a little bit more about that, perhaps deeper dive.
Sure. And I'm going to take a step back, Randy, when it comes to doing interviews like this and Vivek basically talking to numerous media outlets, whether those are right-leaning, left-leaning, CNN, MSNBC, Fox. Vivek says all the time, there's other presidential candidates who are either afraid or they refuse to go on to interviews that are so-called tough interviews or with left-leaning outlets. And Vivek says all the time, how are you going to sit across the table from our adversaries like China, like Mexico, and be tough with them and put America first if you are afraid to sit with media outlets and reporters who will ask you tough questions? As far as China is concerned, a big part of Vivek Ramaswamy's foreign policy implementation is to declare independence from China. Look at the spy balloon that was floated over America. Incredible weakness by President Biden that Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time. If that were a Russian spy balloon, it would have been shot down immediately. But China was allowed to fly it over the entire United States, gather intelligence data, and send it back to our adversary. So under a Vivek Ramaswamy presidency, those days are over. They're over. And he is going to declare an independence from China. And it's going to be tough on businesses. A lot of businesses are still going to engage in selling their goods and earning profits from China. But again, those days are over until there is a free and fair flow of ideas and fairness when it comes to China and the United States of America.
Okay, so just to get to that last point, there's an old expression, the war on drugs, and drugs won. The war on poverty, poverty won. So if we have this kind of proxy or Cold War against China, what are the delineations of victory, and when do we, what are the parameters by which we say, oh, this has made progress enough? What are the lines drawn to measure or gauge the metrics by which China will have presumably acceded, but probably not, to our demands and goals?
Well, it's basically the United States of America being in a position of strength over our largest enemy. And Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time that the United States should not be fighting a war in Ukraine, that we are taking our eyes off the most important foreign adversary, and that most important and dangerous foreign adversary is China. I'll talk about China in a minute, but I want to go back to poverty, because you mentioned the war on poverty, and look at the trillions of dollars that the United States government has spent on fighting the so-called war on poverty, and yet it still exists, starting with the Great Society, going back to Lyndon Johnson. And Vivek Ramaswamy firsthand, he went to the Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia to see how fentanyl and poverty is just destroying our inner cities. He went to the south side of Chicago to see it himself as well. So Vivek Ramaswamy says the best way to build people up, the best way to build Americans up, the best way to let people succeed is capitalism, the free market, and not big government. So getting back to China, the most important part of his foreign policy plan is basically declaring independence from China, and that it's not fair that they are treating us unfairly, that they are our biggest adversary. And the fact is, we have to be tough with them. Again, the Chinese spy balloon, as an example. If that were any other nation, it would have been shot down immediately, but President Biden was weak and he let it fly over the United States of America. So Vivek Ramaswamy has a clear message to China. You know, your days of basically having unfair advantages over the United States, those days are over. And it's going to be very difficult for a lot of businesses who do business in China, but it's time to stand up for them. Joe Biden has not, but Vivek Ramaswamy will.
I'm on board with a lot of that. I do. We'll maybe come back or leave it as a matter of further discussion to find out exactly what would be the things that China would have to do. I don't want to pin you down too much on that, but I think that needs to be better defined. Otherwise, it becomes an endless war. It's a little bit like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where we have to determine what the limits are. I think that one of the ways Mr. Trump is really good is in the art of the deal, and figuring out what are the parameters and try to deal with enemies. You know, people made fun of him for sitting with, I think it's Kim Jong-un, and
North Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, whatever. But there are certain parameters. You can't necessarily, make Kim Jong-un into, John F. Kennedy right off the bat, or make North Korea immediately into the UK. Nor would they want to, nor would it fit. But there are ways in which you figure things out. What are the right things? You stop flying missiles over Japan, whatever. You try to figure out what the things are, the goals that you can get, so you can move in a positive direction. And ultimately, I think with our history of the erstwhile Soviet Union, we're firm and strong, and eventually we won, but not through any given act. We won through being firm and not confronting them on every aspect. We won by being better at providing for the needs of our people versus what they did. So they basically imploded. We saw that a little bit potentially with the Wagner group, sort of advancing on Moscow, that governments that are not good to themselves, good to their own people, can implode. I think that's China's biggest fear is Tiananmen Square. I think some of their reactions after SARS 1 in 2003, where people did riot and they had Tiananmen Square fever. I think that's the real virus, is freedom and so forth, and as far as perceived by the Chinese. So I think their biggest fear is Tiananmen Square 2 or 3. And I think a lot of their overreactions with SARS 2 and zero COVID and all that kind of stuff, even as recently as last year, are part of the fact that they want to bottle things up. Their biggest threat is Hong Kong, is liberty, and so forth. And I think Vivek, probably understands that, and if you want to help, form the melting of the Iron Curtain and the implosion of Soviet Russia vis-a-vis China, that is a kind of an interesting goal potentially. I'm not trying to put words in his or your mouths, but I think in the meanwhile, if you're doing smaller steps, they have to be smaller steps, and it has to be some kind of reasonable parameter. But I'm going to leave that aside because I want to, unless you want to comment on that, I'd like to maybe talk about some other issues.
Yeah, two things on that. The main point that Vivek Ramaswamy makes is that the United States is taking our eyes off the prize from a foreign policy perspective by focusing on Ukraine and not on the true threat, which is China. But you did mention President Trump too. It was just a thought that came, into my noggin here. When it comes to President Trump, he and Vivek Ramaswamy were very similar when Donald Trump came up that escalator for the first time in 2015. He was a business owner and political outsider, but no more. You can only be an outsider once. Mm-hmm. And Vivek Ramaswamy is the true business owner and true political outsider in this race for the presidency in 2024. And he has a very positive relationship with President Trump. He said very positive things about him on the campaign trail. But the point of his campaign for presidency is to take that America First agenda to another level. Again, affirmative action. Any president after Lyndon Johnson could have wiped out that executive order with just a swipe of the pen, right. And other presidents did not. Vivek Ramaswamy is going to do that on day one. Donald Trump talked about building the wall and securing the border. That did not take place. Vivek Ramaswamy is going to build on that and build on the seeds of what Donald Trump planted in 2016.
Fair enough. Now, to build on those seeds, Mr. Trump won election, surprisingly, and he had a Republican majority, I believe, in both the House and the Senate in 2016. And yet, he was unable to do a lot of these things. The entrenched state is the entrenched state. It's entrenched. So given that Mr. Trump, even with the electoral majorities in his own party, encountered this issue of trying to, draw the lines, and the lines were ignored. His own FBI directors in succession, even after he appointed his own Christopher Wray, they ignore him, they undermine him. They have their own interests. So it's if you enter a hive of bees and declare yourself the queen bee, that doesn't mean all the bees listen. And you might get stung. So what are the prospects for accomplishing the worthy task of cutting back this octopus-like envelopment of rights and liberties by agencies, you call the alphabet agencies?
Yeah, that's a great and very fair question. So Vivek Ramaswamy, when it comes to his first day in office, there's a lot of actions he can take that do not need congressional approval, like eliminating affirmative action with the swipe of a pen by getting rid of Executive Order 11246 that was signed by Lyndon Johnson that established it within the federal government. Vivek Ramaswamy knows that Constitution and respects it and loves it. He knows it backwards and forwards, especially with his background of having a law degree from Yale. He's done his research. He's done his due diligence. And a lot of the reforms he wants to put into the deep state, he is allowed to do that as president of the United States, reforming the bureaucracy.
No, I totally get that. But as far as eliminating agencies, I was reading Jonah Goldberg, who used to be kind of a libertarian type, and he had I don't know what happened to Jonah, but he was pointing out how necessary it is for the IRS to have the ability to withhold taxes and income and whatnot. I was thinking, well, what did we do before? The income tax from 1914, the IRS, sort of a civil war, was put up as an emergency proposition by Abraham Lincoln in 1861. It was supposed to have like a 5-year window, presuming the war lasted that or less, and that was that. It was a 3% tax, it was kind of a millionaire's tax, by the way. And before that, they had gotten by with fees and tariffs, kind of the sales tax view, a little bit like the VAT, the VAT done in Europe, but nothing else. And you didn't have a huge bureaucracy. Now, I'm all in favor, so he couldn't imagine what life would be like without the IRS. And I just found it kind of odd. So all well and good. And I imagine maybe Vivek has some concept about that economically, but how does one do it? How do you do it if you can't get everyone else on board with it? I mean, executive orders only go so far, A, and B, they are reversible. So Trump did executive orders, and Biden comes in and undoes or redoes or puts them back in place. So in order to have it be different from that, we used to have an automatic bowling game where the pieces go down, they come flop back up, or bowling pins themselves get reset. How do you need? I think legislation to perform that. I mean, what are the sleights of hand, the legerdemain that Mr. Ramaswamy is going to be able to perform to convince populace and the Congress to do his ideas?
Well, I think first and foremost, you and I are dating ourselves a little bit by having knowledge of that bowling game and exactly what it does when it comes to that. You mentioned the IRS and going back to its formation, with Abraham Lincoln, and look where it's gone then to where it is now, adding 87,000 IRS agents to the federal budget, the federal government. And Vivek Ramaswamy says, wait a minute, we're not going to hire 87,000 IRS agents. We're going to take those resources and use them for police officers in every single school across America. And Vivek has done the research. He believes that he has the authority as president of the United States when it comes to negotiating and canceling or ending or renegotiating union contracts for all of the bureaucrats within the federal government. He believes he has the authority as president of the United States to do that. And it's not sidestepping Congress. It's not going around anyone. Vivek is, pretty firm on the law that he has the authority to do that. He is going to do that. But you need an outsider to do that. Randy, you need an outsider that has no connection whatsoever to the government, no connection whatsoever to the deep state, to have the courage of your convictions to get the job done. And Vivek Ramaswamy is going to do it. Trust me. He has the courage of his convictions, and he will shut down those agencies. He will put in term limits for bureaucrats, and he will shut them down.
Fair enough. I mean, the simple question is, Trump did and wanted those same things, and he was that same outsider, and he had a wave of popularity on a personal basis, and he has a certain amount of animus and force, animation to do that, and yet he couldn't. So I don't want to belabor that point too much. But I'm just wondering what the secret sauce here, aside from wanting it more.
Yeah, 30,000-foot view here, Randy. There's a difference between running for the presidency and then actually being the president and getting the job done. Mm-hmm. And Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time, anyone can run on vengeance and grievance, but what are you going to do to get the job done? And that is the most important philosophy for Vivek Ramaswamy. This is not a campaign of just highlighting problems, of highlighting issues. And we saw that with previous presidents. It was a great foundation that was laid by President Trump, but Vivek Ramaswamy is going to take it and build on it for an American First agenda.
More than that, there were three, Supreme Court justices, all of whom I think have followed through. So, Mr. Trump gets questioned a lot for his application, whether he's a bit better a talker than he is a doer. So I think what you're selling here is that Vivek is a better doer, as well as being actually a very reasonable talker. So he's. Well,
but he also, and real quickly, Randy, but he also has a track record in the business community of success.
Yeah, no, I was going to underline that. I understand what that is, and I'm a medical doctor, and I had not, frankly, heard of his companies, plural, but I'm aware of it, and I read up on it, and I think he's skilled. And I looking at the Harvard Crimson article, I saw that he was a biology interest at that point. I'm not sure what his actual major was. Obviously, went to law school, not medical school.
He was a biology major at Harvard, right, and then Yale Law School.
Yeah, so I think he has a reasonable knowledge. So maybe we can segue a little bit into some other issues, past and future potentially. There was this. I don't know if you heard about this thing. There was this crazy virus. I can't remember the name of it. It had something to do with it was named after a beer in Mexico, Corona or Modelo. I forget. It was coronavirus. What were his views during the episode? Did he speak out? It was hard for anybody to speak out. There was a kind of a big, almost solar eclipse on any news, but from Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci and whatnot. But what were his views then? What were his thoughts about the application of lockdown, emergency powers? My understanding is the National Defense Initiative actually took control of the coronavirus response early on, as if it had been a bioweapon from China, it seems. And even Mr. Trump, this is actually Mr. Jeffrey Tucker's concept from Brownstone, that Mr. Trump on March 9th, 2020, was saying, it's just a bad flu and all that kind of stuff. Take Tylenol, go home, and whatever. And March 11th, he was advocating lockdowns. I think he got briefed or debriefed, whatever the word is, by some kind of security heads that this was actually a Chinese bioweapon. And I think they did that in a part. Maybe some of them believed it, but I think they did it to sabotage him, because the Diamond Princess, I don't want to go too far in this, but Diamond Princess was a boat where nobody was dying, basically 10 people out of 3,711. It wasn't the zombie apocalypse that China was presenting it as. Anyway, so where was Vivek during that time, and what were his views? What are his foundational concepts going forward about such events, whether it's that or some other emergency, which may not be a literal virus?
Right. Randy, Vivek Ramaswamy has the deepest knowledge of science and medicine than any other presidential candidate. He was a biology major at Harvard. He developed treatments for very serious diseases that saved lives. One was a treatment for a disease that would otherwise kill 2- and 3-year-old children. Now they're able to live. Certain cancer treatments. He spent his entire life developing treatments that save lives. With his Harvard biology background, he's very knowledgeable on the subject. Many months ago, Vivek Ramaswamy went public and said the coronavirus came from a Wuhan lab. He was very clear about it, and he was very adamant that there would be repercussions against China when it comes to developing and leaking coronavirus from a Wuhan lab. Vivek Ramaswamy absolutely positively opposes any mandatory jabs when it comes to the government telling parents what to do, and especially when it comes to their kids. During the height of coronavirus, Vivek was asked to participate in a committee when it comes to the state of Ohio, because he was born in Cincinnati, now lives in Columbus. And the state of Ohio had a commission when it comes to developing plans, policies, procedures about how to handle the coronavirus. And it's my understanding from talking to Vivek and many others that he offered very common sense solutions that was the opposite of what Dr. Fauci was recommending. And this committee basically did not listen to a lot of his common sense regulations. So Vivek Ramaswamy stepped away. Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time that it's very important to listen to a larger group of scientists and not one, Dr. Fauci. And he believes that Dr. Fauci did not handle it as well as it could be. And even from a personal note, Randy, you know, I have 4 children, and my wife and I, we all had COVID at the same time. All of us. As parents, it was a little rough, you know, going through a cold at the same time. And that was the hardest extent of it that we had. But as far as Vivek is concerned, he was one of the first presidential candidates to come out and say that came from a Wuhan lab. Plain and simple, didn't come from a market, didn't come from the forest, didn't come from a jungle. Vivek Ramaswamy says right away, it came from a Wuhan lab. We're going to hold China accountable. He walked away from a commission in the state of Ohio when he was trying to give common sense regulations and common sense policies that oppose Dr. Fauci. He walked away from it, and he is adamantly opposed to any sort of mandatory jabs.
Fair enough. So I actually respect that. I do think he's a very bright guy. I went to Yale undergraduate, and he went to Yale Law School. Yale Law School is not necessarily a barometer of political, knowledge per se. I mean, it is a process of political acumen. Both Hillary and Bill Clinton went to Yale Law School.
Yeah, so don't hold it against Vivek then.
Yeah, I know. So, yeah, and what we've seen from Harvard, you know, Harvard was the main defendant in the affirmative action case. What never gets brought up, I'm sure you've seen these kind of righteous, sanctimonious, virtue signaling signs on people's lawns. One is "Stop Asian Hate," and I passed by a place. House, which I'm sure is of the left persuasion. They don't mow the lawn. They've got all nice little weeds and growing out, whatever. And they have the Stop Asian Hate. But I was thinking, I bet they're against the ruling about the affirmative action case by the Supreme Court. But it was a group of Asians, as it were, who made the case that they were being discriminated against. So if you literally want to stop Asian hate, or at least stop Asian dislike, or at least stop prejudice against Asians, you would be totally in favor of having schools judge people for who they are and their own characteristics. I'm wondering, did Vivek have a thought about that ruling, and going forward about kind of equal opportunity versus kind of equal results?
That is such a great question, because it reminds me of the morning that the ruling came out. And this is why Vivek Ramaswamy is just a smart, bright guy who thinks multiple steps ahead. When that ruling came out, a lot of us thought, okay, this is wonderful. The Supreme Court ruled, puts an end to affirmative action. And Vivek Ramaswamy says, well, wait a minute. What's going to stop them from doing an end around and is implementing other policies to go around the Supreme Court ruling? And literally, Randy, within minutes, Harvard came out and said, okay, now we're going to use essays, and we're going to talk about race and essays. I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy literally wrote the book on woke-ism, Woke Inc. And when it comes to the Supreme Court ruling, obviously he was a supporter of that, but that's why he wants to end affirmative action within the federal government. It's got to go farther than college campuses. It's got to go farther than a Supreme Court ruling. So from day one, he's going to end that executive order and end affirmative action within the federal government. And he is a Harvard graduate. He's a biology major, graduated from Harvard, and he had some pretty tough choice words for the university when it comes to
No, I think he's absolutely right
policies.
about that. I think that clearly they're going to do by other means. It's an amorphous thing. It's trying to like pin a worm. You want to do this, but the worm wriggles and wiggles and so forth. And so they're going to do other things. They're going to like populate certain schools. They're going to look at geographic areas. They're going to find, they're going to find other signifiers to do exactly what they want to do. So a lot of these things only seem to go away when they approach, popular or unpopular scorn, as we've seen with Anheuser-Busch, InBev, Bud Light, the Dylan Mulvaney scandal, which has continued to be, speaking of jabs, be a great vaccination against people buying their beer. And I don't think
they're pretty good at people not wanting to buy their product.
Yeah, so I don't think they've actually learned. I was listening to an interview with the CEO of Anheuser-Busch. Again, I'm not going to the whole corporate scale, but he was saying that, not really they made a misstep. They've always been, a firm believer in LGBT, et cetera, rights and whatnot. And my feeling, I think Ann Coulter wrote a book, Shut Up and Sing. She'd been to a Barbra Streisand concert, one of her, farewell tours, and paid top dollar at the time, probably the equivalent of $500,000 today, to sit near the front because she liked Barbra Streisand, and Barbra Streisand spent her a good fraction to exhort people politically, whether it was for Hillary or whatever that was the thing at the time was. Just like basically Ann Coulter's in their mind saying shut up and sing, which of course you can't do simultaneously, but it's like I see this all the time, whether it's in religious institutions or academic institutions, everyone blurs the line. Everyone's doing the same rah rah rah. They're cheerleading, usually for something that's relatively unpopular politically, but they're willing to do it anyway. So there's very little voice, in the academy and in entertainment, so forth, for half the population. And here is one instance where InBev, Anheuser, whatever, Transheiser, as some people call it, got the message, maybe, but they haven't fully. So some of this has to be the message. I was unaware that he wrote literally the book Woke Incorporated. I'm going to have to take a look and I'll put it up.
Yeah,
but I think that is an actually reasonable approach because Larry thinks of the world. He's the CEO of BlackRock, which is another three-letter title, CEO, but he's doing the ESG and then the SEL, and it morphs from one type of thing to another, which exists and doesn't exist. CRT, exists. It doesn't exist in the schools, but we're not going to stop doing it. So how do we get at those other three-letter, not the three-letter agencies, but the three-letter agents of our societal disruption, say, or potential schism?
Yeah, Vivek talks about that on a regular basis, how the government, basically what they can't get done through the front door, they'll use businesses do their dirty work at the back door, pertaining to ESG, things of that nature, and using corporations to implement a lot of those policies. Vivek Ramaswamy talks about the fact that in America right now there's a hole in a lot of people's hearts, and they're filling it with, he calls them cults. The climate cult, the COVID cult, the trans cult. And that if that heart is going to be empty, people are going to fill it with something. So from his perspective, he wants to fill it with this America First agenda, with patriotism, faith, hard work, a lot of those values that we used to have, a lot of the same values that we can definitively define what America is. And it's dangerous with a lot of those different cults. Again, the climate cult, COVID cult, trans cult. But when it comes to wokeism, this is an important point when you talked about like Bud Light, Target, things of that nature, and this cancel culture. And I'll share a personal story about Vivek that went and became very public. Yeah, there's his Woke Inc. It's his very first book right there. Again, he literally wrote the book on wokeism. But there was a newspaper in Iowa that put forth a horrifically racist, inappropriate cartoon, a political cartoon that appeared on their editorial page of Vivek Ramaswamy. Incredibly racist, tied him into a lot of horrific conservatives in this cartoon, and basically, used phrases that, we called out right away that was racist. And, they only said that because Vivek is a person of color. And so a lot of people would think, okay, the guy wrote the book on Woke Inc. He's going to lead the charge and say, let's cancel this newspaper, let's cancel this cartoonist. And Vivek took the high road and said, no, They apologize. I accept their apology. That editorial cartoonist should not be punished. That person should not lose their job. I accepted their apology and we move on. And so that's his philosophy. He talks about and holds, this woke culture accountable, but he doesn't engage in that typical
right.
cancel
So he's not going
culture.
to do right. So this is often the problem with so-called anti-racism, anti-fascism. Again, high-minded terms, a little bit like the affirmative action thing. Nobody wants to be pro-racist. So they take the high road with their terminology, but they're using the same means and modalities. So the Antifa is literally fascist. The biggest, they're redolent of the brown shirts of Hitler, Hitler Youth and so forth, to go around and rampage without repercussions, to be quasi-governmentally encouraged, to have Kamala Harris bail some out and whatnot. And so we've seen a huge spike in crime and intimidation on one side. And then, to be anti-racism, to fight racism with racism. Like it's okay to be racist if you're, racist against the wrong people. This is very short-sighted because it just makes a kind of a spinning turntable round and round. So it just winds up who's on top at one given moment or another. So I appreciate that. I actually enjoyed his repartee with Don Lemon, the ex, was he CNN?
Former.
Yeah. Maybe you could just discuss that for our viewers a little bit. Do you remember that episode?
Oh, do we ever? Yeah, it was Don Lemon's last time on set. It just came off.
Oh, was it his last? Oh,
yeah, he got fired right after that. It just came on the heels of Vivek Ramaswamy getting a huge standing ovation at the NRA conference. And Vivek talked about the fact that a lot of anti-gun laws were put in place by a lot of politicians many, many years ago to suppress the strength of the Black community. They did not want African Americans to be armed. And that was the root beginning of a lot of gun control laws in America. Vivek also talked about the fact that, hey, we want to help Taiwan. Let's open a branch of the NRA in Taiwan. Standing ovation, made news across the country, especially his position when it comes to gun laws and African Americans. So Don Lemon had Vivek on CNN, and somewhat paraphrasing here, Don Lemon basically said, even though you're a minority, Vivek, you're not Black. You don't know that experience. You can't definitively talk about facts, even though what Vivek talked about were cold, hard facts. And Vivek went right back, didn't buy, any of it, really challenged Don Lemon, became a huge controversy. At the end of the day, CNN wound up terminating Don Lemon. A lot of people do believe it was because of that interview. But there's a point about racism on the campaign trail that Vivek makes. And Randy, you touch on it a little bit. Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time, reverse racism is racism. An unborn life is life. A lot of these are part of his 10 truths that are on Vivek2024.com. And Randy, you also mentioned Antifa. Let's talk about that and how there's two tiers of justice in the United States, one for the privileged ruling and other classes, and then for the rest of us. Look at the way Antifa and Black Lives Matter basically rioted, destroyed communities, attacked police. And a lot of those individuals not only got slaps on the wrist, but you mentioned Kamala Harris helping individuals get bail out of jail. Yet there were people who actually just walked into the Capitol on January 6th, and they're spending years in prison. Look at Hunter Biden for that example. The Justice Department, if it were any other individual facing similar charges to what Hunter Biden is facing right now, a lot of people do believe that person would be in jail for quite some time, that Hunter Biden is getting a sweetheart deal. Look at Donald Trump.
Along with his big guy.
Right, exactly. And you want to talk about the deep state and the Justice Department, look no further than Donald Trump. When the original charges from Alvin Bragg came out, Vivek Ramaswamy was the first person to say, we should not weaponize law enforcement to attack our political enemies. And the person who would most benefit from Donald Trump being charged and knocked out of this race is Vivek Ramaswamy. But he still took the position of, I don't want to win this way. It's not fair. It's not right. And the Department of Justice should not weaponize, prosecutors to punish political opponents of the deep state. And so those are Vivek's positions on that.
I appreciate that. He has integrity and he has consistency. And a lot of other candidates are competing against Donald Trump. They're not necessarily going out and saying what he says. And I think he's absolutely right here. The New York Times is, I find it amusing, oftentimes, alongside candidates' defense of Trump, and this part I highlighted, could undermine the rule of law. Oh my, as if that hadn't been happening. And I think clearly, if his name were, Edward Frump, he would not be targeted for these types of things, which clearly other candidates have been doing. I don't know. There was somebody whose name rhymed with Hillary Minton, who tore up subpoenas basically, and
private server,
and was profiteering off of government information. Her foundation, they went from impoverished leaving the White House to $500 million in net worth, and that happened somehow. I think I always give the Democrats credit for being thoughtful, not necessarily about actual running businesses, but how to essentially monetize their very relatively mundanely paid political positions. So Mr. Biden, I don't think just came up after being VP to figure out how to get his brother and his other relatives involved in a money scheme, selling and peddling influence. I think this has been going on probably far longer, and this is just one aspect of it. But so I give them credit for that, and I give credit for Vivek for pointing this out, that this is election interference. In Brazil right now, the just recently ex-president who lost in a close vote, which had lots and lots of questions, because they don't have the electoral college. They have just one sweeping. So if you have kind of vote pollution in one area, kind of like that cloud from Quebec, it'll just spread. And so the corrupt or poor left or north, they probably ballot stuffed and harvested a lot, and boom, it just kind of swept over. They had really unseemly vote pluralities for their candidate Lula, who was the next ex-corrupted president, and he beat Bolsonaro. So what they did was they basically determined now that the Lula's president, that Bolsonaro can't run until 2030 because stuff, and so they weaponized their electoral process, and they're basically the people who get tagged are obviously the most dangerous. In Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi, I think she got the Nobel Prize, and she was under house arrest for a decade or more. They did that because she was the most likely democratic threat to the dictatorship. We don't like to call that here, and we're always eager and able to point out voter problems and inequities in places we don't like, but it very well may be happening here. To wit, another question about the actual electoral process: is it possible that no Republican can win this election under the post-COVID mail-in ballots? I mean, there had always been absentee ballots. Why we needed forced like dissemination, broadcasting of ballots, another question. Can anybody win in this circumstance, given that state by state the rules can be different and possibly corrupted?
My mom died 10 years ago, and I half jokingly say every year since then she's voted Democrat. It's unbelievable. But Vivek Ramaswamy was on a teletown hall with voters in New Hampshire, Michigan, and across the country, and this exact question was brought up, and he was very blunt, that saying right now as a candidate, I cannot change the process. I cannot change the system. That's why I need to win this race for the president of the United States in a landslide. He talks about having a Ronald Reagan landslide going back to 1980, not just winning 51% to 49%, but taking his America First agenda on the road and having a very strong margin of victory. It's a huge concern for all Americans, though. There is nothing more sacred within our democratic process than casting a ballot, one of them, for the person you want to lead the free and Western world and to lead the United States of America. So Vivek Ramaswamy answered that exact question. Right now, there's very little he can do as a candidate for president, but once he is in, hopefully with a Ronald Reagan-like type landslide, then he can put in very serious electoral reforms that protects and maintains the integrity of that process, because it is a sacred process. My whole family came over from Ukraine in 1965. One of the most beautiful moments for me was witnessing my family voting for the first time as Americans. It's sacred, and it's something that Vivek Ramaswamy is going to protect as president.
Right. Getting back to immigration in your own families, he was confronted by a reporter on CNN who conflated his own voting with his not wanting immigrants to just become automatic citizenship. So I think it's called sole juris, wherein if whether you are automatically conferred full American citizenship upon being born here. So this has brought about a huge industry of birth tourism from all different kinds of countries. You come over here, without sounding trivial, you pop your kid out, that kid's a citizen, and then becomes potentially an anchor baby for you and or other chain migration aspects. And he made the point that his family came over illegally, but still, I assume yours did it well. What are his views on immigration, citizenship? And I want to touch a little bit later on the recent proposal he had for some kind of stipend for America promotion to students.
Yeah, as you had mentioned, his mom and dad came here the right way. They came here legally. They did not have a lot of money when they came to the United States of America. They became citizens the right way, and they worked incredibly hard, to build the American dream that Vivek Ramaswamy is living right now. He says he is living the arc of the American dream. And he always mentions, and he says, it's a little corny thing that my dad he says to him all the time, especially in his formative years, that if you're going to stand out, you might as well be outstanding. So using that mantra from his father, he went on to build multi-billion-dollar companies, one being the development of treatments that saved and improved lives, and then went into the financial sector, earned a tremendous amount of, personal wealth in that respect. God bless America, God bless capitalism. And now he's running for president of the United States. So Vivek Ramaswamy talks all the time about the importance of coming here the right way, supporting legal immigration. But the fact that a nation without a border is not a nation. And that's exactly why he wants to send the military to secure the southern border and bomb cartels.
Right. Well, you can't have. Well, I'm going to leave that point open. I will say one thing about it, though, and I want to get back to the scholarship point. But I'm a physician, and part of my medical practice involved detoxifying narcotic addicts. I had a regular primary care medical practice, and in the mid 2000s, this other aspect via Suboxone came along, and I tapered people to sobriety over about 3 or 4 months. But there's been, the opioid crisis, and so we're then kind of got overshadowed by COVID and whatnot. But the first time in the previous 30 to 50 years that the opioid numbers had gone down was under Donald Trump's presidency. And this is part of my book I have not yet published. It's a small chapter within it. But Mr. Trump really didn't emphasize the opioid epidemic. And getting to your point about fentanyl across the border, there's, supply and demand kind of aspect to it. People, want what they want. And the real key is, I think, on the demand aspect of this, the supply will always exist. It's going to get easier and cheaper to make anything. And the availability is always there. There's a lot of liberalization regarding punishment and legalizing all kinds of drugs, including heroin and whatnot. So the demand part is for people to want and to be able to achieve better lives. And again, Mr. Trump kind of was the first person to reverse the death numbers and the addiction numbers for opioids, but he did it without doing it. There was, I think, really zero emphasis during this. You never heard about it. And my own feeling is that the magic potion was getting jobs to middle America, to, the industrial, kind of the forgotten, flyover land, all that kind of stuff people call it. And I understand Vivek is in Ohio and different parts, in central Ohio now. I think the real key, personally, is to get people having some purpose in their lives, particularly men. Men without purpose are the biggest crime problem. Men without purpose are, suicide problem, depression problem, homeless problem, alcohol problem, drug problem. Women Possibly yes, but to a lesser extent, and because men really have much more kind of vagaries in their behavior realm, and if they don't have a reason, if they don't feel fulfilled, they get that. So I think I think a reasonable point possibly for your campaign to address, and maybe you can make this connection, is to get the economy better in places that are ignored, not the coast and so forth. And some of that opioid demand will go down. People don't need fentanyl if they have a promotion, if they have a way of sustaining a family, if they have a way of creating a family, a way of attracting a reasonable partner. And you can't do that, sitting on your butt, and it's hard to get off your butt if there's not some better prospect. Anyway, that's my speechifying. I apologize.
Well, it's a lot of great points, and those are points that are echoed by Vivek Ramaswamy. Number one, he saw firsthand the horrific consequences of the fentanyl crisis plaguing every corner of America by visiting the south side of Chicago personally, by going to the Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia, and it affirmed his position of bombing cartels, securing the border, and stopping the free flow of fentanyl from China and then eventually Mexico. On the economy and building jobs, Vivek Ramaswamy talks about the importance of GDP growth, of getting the economy moving again, because the greatest thing we can do for the American people is strengthen our economy. And a great way to build people up is through capitalism. So Vivek says that Republicans, when it comes to solving an economic crisis, they always talk about let's cut our way to prosperity. Democrats will say, well, we got to raise taxes and generate more revenue in Washington and spend more money. All that got us was record high inflation. Vivek Ramaswamy says all the time, well, wait a minute, you're forgetting GDP growth. You're forgetting about the fact that we should grow our economy. We don't have to print money in the basement of the Capitol. Not only then would it solve our economic crisis, but as you said, Randy, it'll get people back to work. Right now, the Biden administration, there's an incentive for people not to work. And a lot of it was, the excuse given was the COVID crisis. Well, we're just going to send people checks and they're going to sit at home. And now there's a worker shortage in America. Try calling a plumber, an electrician, any of the building trades. Try calling someone to get an appointment now. And you can't because no one is working because there's an incentive from the federal government to stay home. So Vivek Ramaswamy wants to put an end to that. And he talks about the importance of GDP growth to solve our economic woes, but to get people back to work, to not have them sit at home and collect a check from the government.
Yeah. So we're almost at the end of our hour. I want to spend maybe 45 seconds on the scholarship proposal and whether you can incentivize people to have demand, wishes and so forth. And we didn't even talk about the full woke agenda and all that kind of stuff. But as far as culturally, it's some scholarship proposal. Can you just briefly touch on that? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, Vivek Ramaswamy and his wife Apurva, they are donating of their own resources $250,000 with the goal of wanting to help American school children, but also to the importance of building pride in America. So they're going to have basically a contest where they're going to ask college students, give us a video, shoot us a video and send it to us about the importance of American pride and what it means to be an American. It's believed to be one of the largest scholarship opportunities for students in the United States, $250,000 of their own money.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much. Any last words before I'm going to end with one shameless self-promotion, but maybe just give us a last word for you.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that Vivek Ramaswamy is going to make a great president. Now more than ever, we need a business owner and an outsider to destroy the deep state and enforce pride and bring love of country back. Again, the guy's the real deal. He's running for the right reasons. He's not running for the paycheck. He wants to lead a national revival, and I would encourage as many people as possible to cast their ballot for one ballot for Vivek Ramaswamy.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to just segue a little bit. If you'd like this podcast, if you like what we presented here today, you can help support us. I have a book, Overturning Zika. It was the last pandemic. This is maybe people forget, but it was in Brazil. The conjecture was that this dengue-like virus, which had never caused a single human illness on Earth, there were zero testing possibilities in Brazil, that it caused microcephaly in first trimester births, first trimester pregnancy, and later birth. This is the pandemic that never was. It's still important because there's going to be a Zika vaccine very, very shortly, and it's going to be mandated by the WHO throughout the world. That's my opinion. You can buy this book. Hopefully you read it as well. But if you want to help support the podcast, buy the book. Leave a review, hopefully an excellent review. And we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, Stefan. You can stay on. We'll chat. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else.
Thank you for having me. Much appreciated.